atrocities happen. And I want to start all the way over there with you, Robert, to ask you, why? Why does someone leave London, get on a flight, or however they do get there, go to Raqqa? Or, you know, why does someone blow themselves up? Why does this happen?
There are two things which are going to make this discussion very difficult. One, these cases are highly individual. It's highly individual how the perpetrator of the attack, as you rightly mentioned in Manchester, came into that. But there is also, which I think can help us out, there is a discrete culture. There is a subset, a mental language, and each terrorist movement has its code, and they know how to communicate in that code. And what you do is you don't just look at the perpetrator, you look at the code. And there are ways of looking at it now because, as you've been hearing in previous sessions, things like the internet, big data, but above all, social media, can help us give clues. But what you cannot legislate for, and I've been a journalist 51 years, you cannot tell why that particular person, and oddly it's generally more a man than a girl, will suddenly flip and become a terrorist. Quick definition of terrorism, it has to have the component of egregious, outrageous, unethical attack on innocents, on civilian people, by surprise. And it's that ethical component. I tell you, I still go down the streets in very dodgy places that I go to and wonder, not if, but sometimes when it's going to happen.
My major categorization of the participation, the main motivation for the participation of the ISIS militants were threefold, actually. The first one are the psychopaths. I mean, those who dealt with, petty crimes in their past history, like in their previous lives, they were either got involved into like petty crimes, bank robbery, and especially if you look at those, perpetrators in European capitals, you would find, criminal activities in their, previous lives, either bank robberies, rape, distortion, these kind of crimes. So they are just transferring their experience from their past psychopathic life to ISIS and giving probably a new trick, new meaning to what they have been doing. So ISIS was a kind of a scene where they can act their previous performance in a new setting. And the second group are mostly pragmatists. I mean, they have other agendas, and ISIS is just giving them a way, a tool to achieve their own goals. These, pragmatists were especially those who were either in Syria or in Iraq, in order to reach their own local, personal goals, personal objectives. They worked with ISIS and they participated in ISIS. The third, and I think the most dangerous part, was the ideological core, who believed in the ideology and who believed in almost everything written by the past Salafi jihadists, their method of fight against infidels. They saw themselves a kind of a cosmic role in the end of the day. So they want to redeem themselves through the work that they have been doing in their own societies. Now it was time to carry those activities into a new setting in Iraq and in Syria. These are, I think, the most critical component of all the different types of militants who joined ISIS because of the fact that they are going to be the most resilient ones. Mm-hmm. The others can take part from the ISIS organization.
Does it work? What they do, does it achieve their goals? And I want to ask you, Mr. Duran, we've seen the PKK in Turkey wage 40-year activities, to use this neutral word. Has that worked?
Well, for the case of PKK, this organization is an ethnic separatist movement. And Turkey is fighting with this terrorist organization in the last 40 years. And actually, we have lost many people, 40,000 people in this fight. When it comes to evaluate what are the factors that Turkey didn't prevent this terrorist organization attacking on Turkey, actually it is basically about Turkey's unstable, insecure neighborhood. In Turkey we separate this issue into three parts. One part is security, another part is identity issue, and another one ethnic separatist movement, terrorist movement. In terms of economic welfare and security issues, domestically it is okay, but for identity issues, in the last 10 years, Turkey made many things, many achievements in that regard. But when it comes to fighting with terrorism, you have to cooperate. You should receive a cooperation from your neighbors and internationally. But when you look at just in the 1997, the US listed PKK as a terrorist organization. Mm-hmm. And thanks to the political conscience that was created after 9/11, there was a fight against terrorism in a cooperative manner by our allies. But today, we face an enormous threat coming from the US support to YPG, a branch of PKK terrorist organization in Syria. So when you don't get enough international support, even from your allies, it's not easy to face this terrorist organization. Okay. There is arms coming from Washington to PKK, and we face this threat still in our borders. That's the basic explanation for the continuation of this PKK terrorist organization.
Okay, so Peter, you live in Washington. What is the US perspective on what Mr. Duran has just been outlining there?
With regard to terrorism writ large, I'd like to echo remarks made by Robert earlier, which is each case has to be looked at individually. If you look at Daesh, that is much different than PKK, which is much different than Taliban, which is much different than, you mentioned, the IRA or ETA. All of these are terrorist organizations, and all of these have different, Robert used the word codes, but they have different, in French, raison d'etre, reason for being. And trying to understand all of them, I think, is very important, but also to understand that you're never going to understand. There is no justification for terrorism. It is something that has to be not allowed in any type of international structures. There just has to be all nation states, all international organizations do have to have a baseline understanding of terrorism, and the images that you described, Maria, are exactly the images that terrorists use to gain fear into the population, which is the ultimate goal. I think that force, going after the terrorists where they are, there is something to be said for that. But also understanding what drives a terrorist, I think, has increased over time, and that approaches have been changed since the initial 9/11 attacks, which sparked what was called the global war on terror. Technology has changed, and I'd like to talk, I think we should have a full segment on technology. But you did mention, and I don't represent the United States government, but I don't want to dodge your initial question, which is about American support for the Kurds in Syria who were fighting ISIS. First of all, every nation makes mistakes, okay? The United States makes mistakes, and because the United States is a very big country, when it makes mistakes, it makes big mistakes. The support for, and this is true, the support for fighters inside Syria is not, and was not intended to support separatist movement, PKK terrorists. That is the result, but that was not the intent. The intent was to use an available force to kill Daesh fighters. And that's something to keep in mind. I do not believe, well, let me put it in the positive. I believe that Turkey has a legitimate concern and a legitimate gripe against the United States on this specific issue, and I know that conversations are ongoing. But it's important to know that the United States is not intending to support PKK separatism from Turkey. That's not the intent. The intent was fundamentally to fight ISIS fighters.
There are sanctions on your country, sanctions on Iran, Mr. Soltani. What does that do, if at all, to terrorism? And tell me about how you see the definition. So 2 questions there.
There is no consensus or definition of the terrorism. Working almost 40 years in United Nations international organizations, it is very astonishing and very disappointing. Many ambassadors, they know that this is a time to come to common denominator. But because of political, in fact, and diplomatic relations, some being under the superpowers' pressures or so, they just keep quiet. And therefore, we do not have even one definition, at least a common denominator, in the United Nations. United Nations is not doing its job as expected, even just to work out, having meetings and meetings to have some sort of definition for terrorism, and also to work on root cause. Many of us, just thinking loud, we can understand that the poverty, discrimination, invasion, these are all military invasions. These are breeding, in fact, terrorism, because a blood will create another blood. As a nuclear scientist, I want to give a clear message. In nuclear fission reaction, 1 neutron starts, and then billions of neutrons, and then we have huge energy for reactors or a nuclear bomb. We have also global terrorism chain reaction. It means one terrorist act could bring another terrorist because hatred, because of many other consequences everybody knows. In fact, we have to also look at the historical moment when it started that we are paying the price right now in the region by Daesh.
With regard to my friend's comments and sanctions, I think it is important to note, and this is true, that terrorism in most cases is sponsored by nation states. And so there is a money flow, there is an agenda set, and there are nation states behind many, many terrorist organizations. There are links that are sometimes very difficult to follow. In the opinion of the United States government at this time, Iran sponsors terrorism, and as a result of that, it is taking state measures to try to change Iran's behavior.
Okay.
And that is the opinion of the United States, and it's verbalized in a way that is probably not as diplomatic as other past presidents have. And by the way, the policy hasn't changed drastically. They've pulled out of a deal, but issues related to U.S.-Iran relations are not a secret to anybody in this room.
There is a terrible tendency to say when you see an egregious act against your national interest and call it terrorism. That's too easy. That is sloppy thinking. I also disagree with the learned ambassador. I follow where he's going to a point. I actually think the UN could do more about working on terrorism, because, as we say down on the farm in Somerset, if you can't make the cow go through that, you work around and you pull it through. The fact is that there are instruments, conventions of genocide, of crimes against humanity, and you attach it into that. Because I don't think you're going to get a pure rubric, do you understand? So you would understand it, from which you're going to get an instruction, say that you will do this, and therefore we're going to carry out the Convention Against Terrorism. It's an aspiration rather than an instruction, but it can be done. Point two, I think that you've raised a huge question, and the ambassador quite rightly, international cooperation. Let's be quite, and then I'll answer point 4 and point 5 very quickly. Yes, you can and you must encourage it. But if there's one thing I've learned watching it in several countries, as with the nature of terrorists, they are particularly individual. They attain to a particular culture, whether it's Daesh, whether it is the extreme end of Taliban, suicide bombers, or wherever. There's something particular there. So in counterterrorism. What you will get with counterterrorism, you will get selfish interest and the collective interest. There are nations involved in this, like my own, will guard very closely their own national approach and strategy to this, and they will not give much of it away. Very quickly, why the Brits found it very difficult to testify against Mladic and Karadzic at The Hague, in the International Court, was because they didn't want to give away their counter-terror. I'm not saying those two are necessarily terrorists, but their counter-terror techniques of surveillance, which they used against the IRA. Don't tell, it's just between all of us. They still use it, by the way. So you're going to have national interest, self-interest, and then you will have a shared culture. And that's the way in which you can do it. Now, the Brits have got quite an elaborate counter-terrorist procedure, but I think we have to be very careful here, because once you start restricting journalism, as I have been the victim of, very mildly, during the IRA campaign, you are restricting a civil liberty. You are restricting the normal communal civic practice of your country. But, and I think we're all going to go into this, new media, social media, has added an entirely new dimension. Go back to the very beginning of what I've been saying of my colleague at the end. There's something discreet, there's something particular about the message. It's the perfect conduit for that. It's a perfect way of communication. And also, because, as the Italians say, which their journalism isn't supposed to, opinione più dei fatti, it's you put opinions, you put views, rather than well-tested by an empirical process, fact. And this is the real bugbear. But I think, and I'd like to conclude at the end of our discussion, it's the only thing I would really like to leave you with, I think that puts an extra responsibility, an extra challenge on people like me. In the metropolitan, transparent, above-the-ground media, yes, we make mistakes, and you must tell us. But we still must try and tell the truth, and particularly the truth to power, and to reassure of our goodwill and good offices to our wide audience. That is the obligation of a journalist. We cannot walk away from this. You cannot censor it, but it is a vital role, but it's a very tricky role because, as I said, not knowing it, we can aid the terrorist process in some circumstances.
And I want to bring in Ufuk, who's sitting next to you, Ufuk Ulutaş. You've written a book about ISIS, and you watch the developments very closely. Has Daesh, ISIS gone? I haven't. I know we talked about it with regards to Iran last week, although I'm not sure if it's been confirmed. But have they disappeared? Mm-hmm. Are they, in particular, on the decline?
Well, before answering that question directly, let me just raise another point about the definition, the lack of a common definition for terrorism among the international community. I think we are overemphasizing the importance of finding a common definition for terrorism. Because the real problem is not finding a definition. The real problem is putting that definition into practice. Yes. I think PKK is a great case in that sense. Mm-hmm. PKK is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, by the European Union, as well as UK and Turkey. But when it comes to practice, as we have seen in Syria, the practice may be different than the designation, I would say. So definition is kind of a detail in this case than the practice itself. So I would like to emphasize more on the practice rather than the definition itself. Of course, a common definition would be very useful. As to your question, the statistics may be misleading. And those kind of statistics have misled us before. I mean, during the Iraq War, for example, between 2007 and 2009, when the US Army came out and said, the mission is completed. We won the war against the radicals in Iraq. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq is done. They're gone. And we gained the territory back from the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It took only 2 years for Al-Qaeda in Iraq to come back with a different package, with the creation of ISIS, new methods, with a bigger population and controlling a bigger portion of the land in both Syria and Iraq. Of course, ISIS has been degraded due to the several military operations against ISIS in both countries. But you can degrade terrorist organizations using military means, but you cannot obliterate them.
Yeah, sure.
In order to obliterate them, there has to be some simultaneous political, social tracks, which also should include a reconstruction period. The real question is, do these countries, Iraq and Syria, still retain the breeding ground for terrorism? Unfortunately, they do. They do.
How safe, and this is a question for you, Mr. Duran, how safe is Turkey?
Well,
right now?
Turkey, Istanbul is safe as London and Paris are. So I know that after 2015 and 16 bombings, you may ask such a question. But, Turkey, after the problems in those years, Turkey started to follow a new policy of security, dealing with security and combating with terrorism beyond her borders.